Okay, now that we've set our game up, the next thing we want to do is we want to start putting in the rules. In order to do this, we're going to take advantage of some of the advanced actions. So the first action that we need to take care of is the setup of our game. Now you can imagine when somebody comes to this game and they start playing, we don't want them to see the too high or the too low feedback. So we're going to need to hide those. Another piece of setup that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to go ahead and assign some random number. Otherwise, there's not much point to the game. And then we'll also account for the fact that maybe at times people will have already played the game and they're resetting it. And so we'll need to reset our tries remaining back to 3 in case that's not the case. So let's go ahead and do that now. If you go up to Project and you click on Advanced Actions, is the first option there. Now you notice here we have the Create from Blank, Action Type, and the name of the action. So far we have no actions down here. We are going to choose a standard action. The other option, if you look on here, is a conditional action. Now the setup shouldn't depend on any sort of condition in this case. So we're going to go ahead and leave it as a standard action, and I'm going to name this action Setup. Now that I've named it Setup, the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and hide those two pieces of feedback. So when I click on this Actions and the drop down gives me a whole bunch of choices, I type H and the first thing that comes up is Hide. So I'm going to hide. Now remember I named my text fields. Well, that's going to be useful for me. In this case I named them both FDBK, feedback, which puts them right by each other. So I'm going to hide the feedback too high. And I'm going to create another action just like that, only for the too low. So hide and feedback too low. Great, so now I've hidden both my pieces of feedback. Now that I've done that, what I need to do is I need to reset the tries remaining to 3. So in order to do that, I'm going to click on this and I'm going to look for an action called assign. So I'm going to assign a value to a variable. I type A and it's the first thing that comes up is assign. Now it's asking me, I get a drop down that asks me, well, which of these values would you like to assign? In this case, I want the tries remaining variable that I named at the beginning. So tries remaining, and it asks, would you like to assign it with the value of some variable or with a literal? In this case, I want a literal because I want it always to be 3 at the beginning of the game. Great. So far, we've been able to hide both of our feedback boxes and assign a value to our tries remaining. What we need to do now is we need to generate a random variable. This is going to require a little bit more work because we're going to use some JavaScript in order to generate the random number, and then we need to use the JavaScript to set the value of the number that we generated to the variable randNum that we created earlier. So let's start by going under Actions and double-clicking. And when we double-click, we're going to look for Execute. We're going to execute JavaScript. I'm going to type E. The first thing that does is take me to exit. I don't want exit, so I'm going to type E again. And that goes to Enable. And now the third E is Execute JavaScript. So I'm going to click on that. It says Script Window and Select Window. I'm going to go ahead and select the window to be the current window. And then I click on Script Window, and what will appear is a window in which I can write down my JavaScript. I'm going to paste in some JavaScript that I've written for this purpose, and then I'll talk you through it. The very first thing I do is I create a variable named min, and I set it to a value of 1. And I create a variable named max, and I set it to a value of 1000. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a little bit of JavaScript that's commonly used to generate a number at random between 1 and 1000. I've named that random_num, and that's not the same as the randNum that I created earlier, and I'll show you that in just a second. Math.floor will round this number down. So if it generates a 0.9 and then I multiply that by 1000, it'll round that down. And then I've gone ahead and used a little bit of JavaScript, math.random method, to generate a random number, and that'll generate a number between 0 and 1. I'm going to multiply that by my maximum number minus my minimum number, and then I'm going to round that whole thing down and add my minimum number to it. In essence, what this does is it generates a random number between 1 and 1,000. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I need to take this number that I've now generated and set the value of randNum variable that I created earlier within Captivate to this random num that I just generated. So the way that I do that is I use this little bit of code here, window.cp API interface. That's how I access the interface methods within Captivate. And then there's a method called setVariableValue. SetVariableValue takes two arguments. The first argument is the variable I would like to set, and the second argument is the value I would like to set it to. So in this case I said take the randNum variable that I created earlier and give it the value of random_num that I just generated. Now I go ahead and click OK, and make sure you save that as an action. If I save that as an action, in this case it says script saved successfully. Great. Now that that's the case, I can close my advanced actions. And now I think, hey, I can go ahead and preview this just to see. And before I preview, I always like to ask myself what I expect to see. So let's go over that really quickly. Well, our setup should hide both of the feedback, and it should set both of these variables, randNum and tries remaining. Now if I were to look at that, I do have randNum and tries remaining that should show up on my screen. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that and see what happens. Once that generates, I can see right away, well, first of all, my random number is 0, and that was my initial value that I set it to, and I told it to choose a number between 1 and 1,000. So that tells me that the random number wasn't ever generated. And I also see that it didn't hide my feedback, and I can't see any sort of guesses remaining. So initially you might think, oh no, we've messed up, we've done something wrong. Well, let's go back to Captivate and look at what might happen. We created a script or an advanced action called setup, but did we ever tell our game to actually run this setup? No, we didn't. So what we need to do is as soon as this first screen loads, we want it to run the setup action. So with the slide selected, I'm going to go over here to properties, and instead of having the style selected, I'm going to make sure I have the action submenu selected. And it's going to have the option on enter. Well, on enter, do we want the slide to just continue, or do we want it to do something else? In this case, we want it to do something else. What we want it to do is to execute an advanced action. And the advanced action we want is our setup. Because that's the only one we've created so far, it's the only one that appears. So now that I click setup, I can go ahead and preview, and I'm going to see what happens. We expect to see our variable values, and we expect to see our feedback hidden. And sure enough, our feedback here is hidden, and I do have a number between 1 and 1,000, but our guesses remaining doesn't appear to be showing up. I'm going to click on the submit button. Now remember, I haven't actually done anything with the submit button yet, but the default action for a button when you create it is to continue on to the next slide. That's going to show us what our next slides look like. So just going to show you that really quickly. If I click on it, it takes me to the got it slide, and the got it slide plays for 3 seconds and moves on to our lose slide, which says nope, it was, and it should be showing us what the value of that random number was, which we saw a minute ago was 697. So we need to go back, and I'm going to show you this again. Our random number is showing up, but our guesses remaining isn't showing up here, and it's not showing up on our last slide. Let me go back and show you why that is. If we look in here, I do have this variable. It should be showing up, and it looks like it's set up just the same as the random number variable. The thing is, the random number has a little bit of space underneath and the size of this box. If I just click on this box with tries remaining and make it a little bit larger, it ought to show up now. And the same is true on the lose condition slide. We've made our box just a little bit too tight so that second line isn't showing up. So now if I were to go back to the beginning, I'm going to click on preview in browser. We ought to be able to see all of our variables. And sure enough, guesses remaining 3 shows up. If I click on submit, I go to my got it slide for 3 seconds, and then it's going to move on to my lose slide, and it shows me nope, it was 357. So that is our first advanced action.